They used to make windshield wipers here, but in the late 1980s, the Trico Products Corporation closed most of its operations in Buffalo and laid off more than 2,000 workers. Then the company opened a new plant in Mexico, just a mile from the United States border. For several years, Gene Martin has been filling out forms at the State Employment Office.
I worked here for 19 years and thought I was going to have another 19 years to work here. Took the jobs to Mexico, and 2,500 of us were gone, out of work. And I had to restart, retrain all over again. Used to see, on this floor alone, there were hundreds and hundreds of people working. Constant machinery being moved around and equipment being repaired and parts being assembled and shipped to the next phase wherever it was going, and then all of a sudden, nothing. Wide open spaces. It's history. It's gone.
By 1996, fewer than 200 production workers were left at the remaining Trico plant in Buffalo.
Fíjate, estos señores van a este lugar. Este es el Libramiento Insurgentes, este es el Boulevard Díaz Ordaz, allá casi, allá, ¿verdad? Van a esta es una maquiladoras.
Sí, maquiladoras.
Maquiladoras, sí.
Es donde todo este...
Tiene que darle para atrás. Esa ya se acabó el parque de Morelos. Sí, sí, hay
Six days a week, Alicia Sanchez boards the bus in Matamoros for the half-hour ride to the Trico plant in the Finza Industrial Park. The workforce here is typically young, female, and originally from Mexico's interior, where jobs are hard to find. In Buffalo, Gene Martin made about $15 an hour. In Matamoros, Alicia Sanchez and her fellow Trico employees make about $1 an hour for the same work. The Trico plant is only one of about 2,000 manufacturing and assembly plants on Mexico's northern border. All of them were built since 1965 under a special Mexican program to attract foreign investment. They're called maquiladoras. Most are U.S. owned, but there are companies from Canada, Europe, and Asia here too. Together they employ about 500,000 Mexican workers. The company names are familiar. They make auto parts, TV sets, chemicals. New factories are going up every day. Some call this the new industrial heartland for U.S. corporations. Along Mexico's 2,000-mile border with the U.S., the maquiladoras are clustered around several paired cities. The factories are usually located within a few miles and sometimes within a few yards of the border. Most companies moved to Mexico to take advantage of low Mexican wages. But something else kept operating costs low. Companies didn't need to comply with costly environmental regulations. When you cross the border, when you pass across that invisible line, the rules change. The Fine Goods recently moved their furniture factory from Los Angeles to Tijuana, a 3-hour drive to the south.
We were manufacturing furniture in Los Angeles for about 35 years. And about 4 years ago, the environmental regulations that are specific to Southern California got too stringent for us to continue to operate in Southern California. And we looked at the possible alternatives as to where to move, and Mexico seemed to be the best choice at the time. Here in Mexico, the environmental laws are virtually duplication of the basic EPA laws in regards to finishing operations within a furniture factory. It's the Southern California laws that are extremely stringent, and it was because of the smog conditions in Southern California, the law required a limit per day of how many pounds of solvent that could go into the atmosphere, and it was that law that would limit us to, on some occasions, stop work at 2 o'clock because we had reached our limit for our permits for the day. As an American company doing business here in Mexico, any hazardous materials that are created have to be exported out of the country again by hazardous waste hauler and their licensed haulers. And we do that. It's basically the same operation that we had in the United States. We operate here under all of the rules and regulations the Mexican government would apply.
Danny Finegood goes by the rules, but many maquiladora operators don't. Wastes in unmarked drums stored behind plants and untreated factory wastes dripping into open canals are the first clues. That's just the beginning. The U.S.-Mexico border has been described as a 2,000-mile-long open sewer, a vast toxic waste dump. The law that requires U.S.-owned factories to return their hazardous wastes to the U.S. was often ignored. In the early 1990s, about 90% of these wastes were being stored or disposed of illegally in Mexico. Fundamentally, Mexican environmental law is similar to the Environmental Protection Agency's rules in the U.S. But Mexican environmental law is new. It's only been on the books since the late 1980s. By that time, the Maquiladora program had been going on for more than 20 years.
I think the pollution problems in the northern border of Mexico are directly related to a program of rapid industrialization unaccompanied by parallel development of either environmental regulatory capability or basic physical environmental infrastructure like water and wastewater treatment and municipal solid waste management. I think the links are clear if you look at the history of this region. They need about 1 million new jobs a year. They desperately need more capital investment. The pressure to provide jobs, to provide a climate that is conducive to investment, either foreign or domestic, can often override or tend to obscure environmental concerns. And without an active and informed citizenry, those problems continue to get swept under the rug.
Environmental problems at the border did get attention in 1990 when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, was first proposed. The national press reported continuing environmental damage despite Mexico's new laws.
Enforcement of environmental law is the key element of environmental law. You can have all the restrictions you want, and if they're not enforced, industries have no incentive to comply.
The debate over NAFTA included this: free trade could set a potential ecological disaster on a high-speed course. On the other hand, a treaty with environmental provisions could stop the destruction in its tracks. Almost overnight, environmental issues became central to the relationship between the United States and Mexico. In the end, some environmental measures did become part of NAFTA, setting a historical precedent. By the time the treaty went into effect in 1994, a new era of environmental activism on the border had begun. In this documentary essay, we look at the consequences of 25 years of environmental neglect, the results of 5 years of earnest activity, and the promises made for the future. We begin in Brownsville at the southern tip of Texas. Travel across this bridge and you're in Matamoros. Once, before industrialization, the area was covered with palm trees like these. A few remain in this carefully tended preserve, a sublime memory of the past. Domingo Gonzalez, an environmental activist in Matamoros and Brownsville, took us on his toxic tour of Matamoros. We began at the Química Fluor plant owned by DuPont. Here they make hydrogen fluoride, a chemical referred to by its initials, HF.
HF, or hydrogen fluoride, is extremely dangerous. It can cause the same type of damages that were caused by the accident at Bhopal, India. And the big danger, of course, is that there could be an accident, a chemical leak at the plant that would be devastating to all of these neighborhoods here. The plant was established before there had been any scientific testing of just how dangerous HF was. In fact, 4 years prior to the 1976 Amoco tests. And those Amoco tests established that a cloud of HF gas could travel at a lethal level as many as 7 miles. Well, obviously, at that kind of toxicity and that kind of danger would be affecting most of, if not all of Matamoros, depending on the wind direction, and also Brownsville, which is just about a half a mile to 3/4 mile from the plant here. And the neighborhoods were here long before the plant was established. But the chemical company essentially wants to create a safety, a liability-free zone around it, where they would not be liable for any damages in case of an accident. They were responsible to some degree. They did pay for crop damages. Their emissions supposedly affected the plants. And we can see that this community here was totally reliant on agriculture. And in fact, these are the brand new grain sorghum plant that is coming out now. So DuPont and their Mexican partners are essentially compounding a problem they created way back. They never should have established a plant that was this dangerous, this close to a city. And second, they definitely should not try to dispossess even more people, leaving them without property so that they can have a zone within which they feel safe in manufacturing HF. And Stepan Chemicals begins there.
Our second stop, the Stepan Chemical Company, whose U.S. headquarters are in Chicago. In Matamoros, they make chemical ingredients for cosmetics. Until recently, they made pesticides here too, and they dumped toxic wastes into open ponds on their property.
But worse still, they were dumping totally untreated wastewater into the canal in the back. That's where we found levels of benzene, we found mercury, we found xylene. Plus, Stepan was consistently having all sorts of problems with their equipment. They would have from ammonia leaks to gas explosions of all sorts. Let's go down that little road beyond this car here. Buenas tardes. ¿Cómo han estado?
Bien, bien.
¿Cómo están desde la fiesta?
The U.S. has right-to-know laws which give citizens the right to get information about hazardous materials in their community or workplace.
Buenas.
Mexico does not have right-to-know laws, so environmental activists in Mexico have to dig for their own information.
Now it's being used as a garbage dump, is it? A lot of areas. Well, this canal has been covered up farther upstream, but here you can tell what was going on. If we were to test this, we would still find some volatile organic compounds in there. In fact, the last time we tested, we still found over 500 parts per million of xylene. And xylene is supposed to evaporate. It's supposed to be gone. If this were in the U.S., the EPA would have come out here and forced Stepan and Retzlaff and all the companies to do a combined cleanup. But since we're just about a mile from the border here, on the Mexican side, companies have been able to do it for a long, long time. In fact, they got away with doing it for over 15 years. This neighborhood has suffered from being caught between two chemical plants. Some of the people got used to it, but others would just come in and leave. ¿Cómo los han tratado por ahí?
Estamos, Mingo.
Y ahorita hace ratito que mira gato, sí, nomás venía ahorita acá que dio vuelta, pesta.
It's just now that the wind shifted in this direction, they got the smell from the chemical plant.
Pero no como cuando están los tanques ahí, entonces sí no aguantaban, aunque no vendiera desde allá como queda.
He said it's not as bad as when the holding ponds were there, but it's still very noticeable. You can also see some of the other problems that the industry has brought here. The neighborhoods have grown rapidly, and there just isn't the kind of infrastructure that the neighborhoods need. There are no paved streets. You can tell there are piles of garbage all over the place. And right here at this very corner, people burn their trash since there are no trucks to come pick it up. And there are roughly 120 neighborhoods of this type in the city that don't have the basic services. So let's look at some of the worst housing in the area now. This canal here is both industrial wastewater and a domestic wastewater system for the city. Most cities do not have and cannot afford modern wastewater treatment facilities. In terms of individual wages, the highest paid workers would be making around $6 to $7 a day. And with that kind of wage, workers cannot afford regular housing. They cannot afford a mortgage. So most people wind up living in houses that they build themselves on whatever land is available that is public lands that they can squat on. That is a type of dilemma that U.S. investment has created. Too many people, not enough infrastructure, not enough housing. We're at the special education school in Matamoros, and it was the director of this school who, in the early 80s, began to notice that there were similar characteristics among some of the kids. She began to do some research on her own and discovered that all the kids belonged to moms who had worked at one particular factory, the Mallory Capacitor Factory, and had been, while they were pregnant, had been exposed to all sorts of chemicals, including PCBs and ethylene and many, many others. The Mallory kids, as they came to be known, had birth defects that ranged from very mild retardation to very severe deformities. These kids were sort of the canaries in the Maquila program. They were the first victims of this massive exposure to toxic chemicals at the workplace and in the environment.
Across the border in Brownsville, there were more than 30 cases of anencephaly, a birth defect that is nearly always fatal. The frequency was more than 10 times the national rate.
Well, what we first observed was extremely blatant. It was in a relatively small hospital in Brownsville, Texas, where we have between 2,000 to 2,500 deliveries a year. We had 3 babies born with anencephaly in a 36-hour period. The babies are born with nothing from the skull back, so that the eyes, of course, are on the side instead of in the center. The ears are usually malformed, and if you look at the baby, sort of like an aerial view, there's no cap over the head. They're referred to in medical literature as frog-like. When we contacted the government in late spring, early summer of '91, and they came down and did the investigation in July of '91. By September of '91, what they were saying to us, oh, it's nutritional. It's probably the fact that women in your community are very poor and are not getting an adequate diet. Well, you know, people in the valley have been poor for a very long time, and nutrition didn't dramatically change in the fall and winter of '90 that produced all of these anencephalic babies. I mean, I don't know a lot about epidemiologists, and I quickly learned that, you know, I'm not sure that a lot of people really do know how to approach this problem, and it happens to be where the community is in the priority interest of the government agency, what the answers come out, and that to me was unbelievable. It really, really was. All of our instincts really told us, let's go back to the mothers. Over a third mentioned to us the industry and the smell from the industry and what is that doing to me, and I've often wondered if that was affecting me. Until then, I didn't even know we had a maquila program. I didn't even know we had industry. Until October of '91, I did not know we had industry. I thought we were predominantly agricultural. And it took getting in the car and going to find the industrial parks in Matamoros to just drop my teeth and say, why hasn't anybody told us that our population could be exposed to industrial pollutants? Because I don't think that was certainly not known to me as a healthcare provider, and I think it probably was not known to many people on this side of the border. It was one of our best kept secrets. And in fact, what we had was 94 major U.S. and Canadian plants within 2 to 5 miles of our borders.
"28 families filed suit in Brownsville in 1993. They charged that their children's birth defects had been caused by hazardous chemicals released into the environment by maquiladoras across the border in Matamoros. The lawsuit was settled out of court in 1995 for a reported $17 million. It is a groundbreaking case for the border environmental movement because it establishes the use of American courts to sue American factory owners for their activities in Mexico. Perhaps because of attention brought by NAFTA, perhaps because of the anencephaly lawsuit, some maquiladoras in Matamoros have become more environmentally conscious. There are hundreds of new stacks on factory buildings. They should make it safer for the workers inside, and where the stacks are fitted with filters or scrubbers, safer for the community outside. General Motors, once exposed for discharging high levels of carcinogens next to this factory, was first to build its own wastewater treatment facility. Soon, other plants at the Finsa Industrial Park will also have a wastewater treatment plant financed by loans set up under NAFTA. Tijuana is 2,000 miles west of Matamoros. It is Mexico's 7th largest city, next door to San Diego, the 6th largest city in the U.S. Shortly after the Chilpancingo neighborhood was settled, the Otay Mesa Industrial Park was built on the hill above it. Maurelio Sanchez is head of the Civic Association.
Y pues nosotros al principio nos pusimos contentos porque creíamos que iba a haber fuentes de empleo aquí cerca de nuestras viviendas. Posteriormente, ya que empezaron a trabajar las empresas, vimos pues que corría agua sucia a cielo abierto y no le prestamos mucha importancia por nuestra ignorancia, no sabíamos qué era lo que eso ocasionaba. Pero cuando vimos que los niños empezaron a enfermarse de la piel, del estómago, y se les empezaba a caer el cabello, nos empezamos a preocupar. Por más de una década, las aguas cambiaban de color 4 o 5 veces al día. Entonces, el número 2, aquí a esta altura, pasaba en las puertas de una escuela. Entonces, esto es triste. Ya en esta comunidad, que es la más pequeña del Cañón del Padre, la colonia Chilpancingo, han muerto 12 niños por anencefalia y 4 más completamente deformes. Entonces, nosotros sospechamos que en esta zona los casos de anencefalia son por el mal manejo de los desechos industriales, porque las madres de estos niños han trabajado en las empresas y viven aquí, donde están expuestas completamente a las corrientes de desechos industriales. Pues esa es nuestra sospecha, pero en realidad no lo vamos a saber hasta que llegue el día que se haga un estudio profundo de dónde vienen los asuntos anencefálicos. Ahí están nuestras protestas.
The Chilpancingo neighborhood pressured government to enforce its environmental laws, and the factories were ordered to stop sending contaminated wastewater through the neighborhood. The flow has been cut to a trickle.
Estas familias están enfermas. Y esto nos preocupa muchísimo, porque es un alto porcentaje de enfermedad que hay aquí en esta comunidad, ¿verdad?
In Tijuana's Vista Alamar neighborhood, community activists Aurora Pelayo and Eduardo Badillo have fought for land rights and for fair salaries. Now they hold workshops to teach Maquiladora employees about environmental hazards on the job, what is dangerous and what to do. It is something you might expect government or the unions to be doing, but that's not the case.
Hemos reunido compañeros de 19 maquiladoras con 19 opiniones. Todos van sobre lo mismo, seguridad. Todos, lo que más les ha interesado en los talleres que han sido de derecho laboral, ellos piden más que todo saber cuál es su seguridad, cuáles son sus defensas, con qué trabajan.
Because Mexico has no right to know laws, workers can't force an employer to identify workplace hazards. From San Diego, the Support Committee for Maquiladora Workers provides information that can help workers to learn on their own.
For example, if someone finds that they're using acetone on the job, they can look in this column here and find the English name, and then over here, see what the Spanish name is, acetona, over in this column. And then in this book are descriptive sheets in Spanish for each of those chemicals. And in these sheets, there is much more in-depth information in regard to what is the actual danger of the chemical, what are the various problems that it can cause health-wise, and what should be done to protect workers who are going to be using this chemical.
Workshop participants didn't want their identities revealed, but they told us about skin irritations and respiratory distress. They were afraid that asking their employers for gloves, masks, or better ventilation could cost them their jobs.
Ese es el real problema que tenemos, por lo menos ahorita, en este lado de la frontera, los mexicanos, que durante mucho tiempo hemos sido gobernados en cierta forma y en cierta forma con sindicatos charros en las empresas maquiladoras. Sindicatos que no se dedican más que a defender al patrón. Son sindicatos patronales.
In the outskirts of Tijuana, another kind of peril to the border's environment, hazardous wastes brought to Mexico from the U.S. Here, the RSR Corporation of Dallas brought used batteries and lead smelter wastes to the Alco Pacifico plant so that the lead they contain could be recycled. We visited the site with Jose Bravo. The Alco Pacifico plant operated for 12 years. After a brief strike, the plant closed in 1991. The place looks like it was abandoned in a hurry. We saw conveyor belts stopped with batteries still on them, pieces of machinery, open vats of mysterious liquids, and piles of residues containing lead.
This is industrial waste, lead waste from the United States, and this is brought here to Mexico and reprocessed again, and more lead is extracted from this, and over to the left of this lead waste is the reddish piles that are then what the result of the smelting process is, and is called lead slag, and that in itself is very dangerous and is the major part of the problem here on the site.
There's a padlock on the front gate, but the fence around these hazards has holes in it, big enough to drive a truck through. And worse, the nearest neighbors to these lead waste piles are dairy cows. The district attorney in Los Angeles sued the plant's American owner for illegally transporting these wastes into Mexico through California. The $2.5 million he won will only pay for a rudimentary cleanup here.
To us, it's what can happen when there is no regulation and when there is inadequate infrastructure in a country that can't deal with its own problems in regards to environmental issues. The question then here for us is, were there no inspectors here for those 12 to 13 years? Was this site never inspected? And if it was, why was it let go like this? Why is there so much contamination here?
Cleanup plans have not yet been finalized by the Mexican Environmental Agency.
So, behind me, it's my community. That is Playas de Tijuana. To my left hand is the whole city of Tijuana. And 1 mile away above those hills is the plant of chemical waste management.
Somewhere in these hills, completely hidden from public view, the American-owned company was building a hazardous waste incinerator.
To burn the PCBs, what was dioxins, and we didn't know anything about. We are housewives, and maybe our world is so narrow that we don't have a lot of information. So, when we didn't know what to do, we were asking ourselves, so what can we do? It was a real problem for us, but we had to think about what was worse, to get into the struggle or to get into the danger of losing our lives and the lives of our children and our food and everything to be poisoned.
Very quickly, the women brought together engineers, doctors, teachers, politicians, and community activists from both Mexico and the U.S. They gathered information, and then they got down to business.
So we had to socially make actions like protest and pressuring by the radio, by the newspapers, TV channels. We had a lot of support from the American TV channels and doing it constantly. The authorities were against us, saying that we were crazy. We didn't know what we were talking about. But amazingly, the President Salinas said exactly what we were saying when he canceled the license to operate this incinerator. Isn't that amazing?
Currently, there are no facilities in Mexico for the disposal of PCBs. At the northern edge of Tijuana, Mexico and the United States are separated by an invisible line, now being made visible by the construction of a metal fence. The fence is supposed to prevent Mexican citizens from illegally entering the United States. The fence has had no effect on the migration of pollution.
I call it the tyranny of the geography. You can see that the city of Tijuana is higher than the counterpart lands on the United States side. So obviously, with the propensity of water to flow downhill, renegade sewage discharges are going to come into the United States. They don't know a border. They only know the law of gravity. What you see here is the low point of the entire Mexican system. And across the fence there is what's known as Mexican Pump Station number 1. And when that pump station has a malfunction or the flows get too large that it can't be taken, the sewage, the raw untreated sewage, goes down to its low point in the system, which is right here, and enters the United States, moves down through these various drains and gullies, and this is only one of many, works its way into the river. The Tijuana River is located in this area over here, and eventually goes all the way down to the beach. We had a situation approximately 6 weeks ago where the entire system in Tijuana went down completely. There was a break in the force main that takes all of the sewage up the hill to their plant. And literally, the entire wastewater production of a city of 1 million plus people came down through this drain. And that type of situation is just intolerable.
And with that, Dave Schlesinger walked us about 300 yards north of the border fence to the place where both countries had finally agreed to build a treatment plant. In 1996, the new binational treatment plant began to rise at a cost of $400 million. To solve a problem that has existed for over 60 years, it will intercept Tijuana's sewage at the border, treat it, and send it through a tunnel 18,000 feet out into the Pacific Ocean. About 3 miles from the new centralized, high-tech, high-priced sewage treatment plant is a big green patch in the otherwise brown hills of Tijuana. It's the site of a low-tech, decentralized sewage treatment project, a marvel of simplicity. It has few moving parts and uses little electricity. It was designed and built by a binational group. It's called Ecoparque.
There's 2 ways of approaching this. One way is to say that wastewater is a problem. The other is to say that wastewater is a resource. When you think that wastewater is a problem, you centralize your facility at the tail end of town, and you get this problem there so that you can dispose of it. But in Tijuana, with no urban greenery, with an erosion problem that manifested itself tremendously in January of 1993. I mean, there was so much mud, rocks deposited in storm sewers, in streets and paved streets, in colonias all over Tijuana. It paralyzed the city that you could see for the first time what erosion was really doing. And when you start talking about revegetating a city as arid as Tijuana, you're going to find yourself with the need for the resource water. And wastewater is 99.97% water. So it's a resource, and if you manage it as a resource, you need to decentralize. Decentralization means small treatment plants, localized in a way they can produce reclaimed water for the benefit of the environment. We're picking up the water from a sewer collector which is down this road. It picks up water from the colonia which is up the mesa here. First step is to get the water into a channel, screen it, get the rough objects out, the plastic bags, the dead chickens or whatever is in the sewer. Then we go into the hydrosieve, screens the rough solids, oxidizes the water a bit. Then we measure the flow rate through a partial flume. Once it goes through there, we release it. As it goes down the trickling filter, biological treatment occurs there, a lot of oxidation. Then we measure again to see how much water is going through each of the 2 filters before it goes into a pipe and into this clarifier. There we pick up the solids and the underdrain. We leave the water, put it into a series of pumps. For the first time, we'll use electrical energy in the system. There, we pump the water up to that tank up there. From that tank, we release it by gravity flow through that sprinkler system that you can see operating right now. I can envision 20 to 25, maybe 30 of these. And as the city would grow, more and more. Because one thing that's unanswered in the centralized facility concept is that what happens when the city grows? We can have an organic agriculture complex here. We can have sales of fruit, bees, honey. We want aquaculture to be incorporated into our activities. We can get the community involved in the environmental preservation within cities. And I think that's very important, especially in places like Mexico and the rest of Latin America, where almost 70% of the population is already living in cities.
The sewage that escapes from Tijuana invades the Tijuana River estuary, an ecologically important wetlands area at the border next to the Pacific Ocean. Until now, there was a Mexican Tijuana River watershed, and there was an American one, and each country made decisions about the area as if that border, and now that fence, had influenced the course of nature. Tijuana community activist Laura Durazo and a diverse binational group want to change that. They view the area as a bioregion, defined not by political boundaries, but by natural boundaries. One of their first tasks was to make their own maps of the bioregion, because every map they had been able to find, in Mexico or in the U.S., stopped at the border.
Okay, this is one of the first maps that we were able to come up with, and it shows how 70% of this watershed is on the Mexican side of the border. So this is the beginning of our basic core of knowledge about the watershed, and we continue with vegetation, seismic faults, and we hope to add layers and layers and layers of information.
We left one of Laura's offices and went to another to continue the conversation.
This famous plaque from 1849 is to remind us of the symbolism of friendship between the people of Mexico and the United States, and to commemorate the idea of a collateral border park, which originally was symbolized by this one circle. And it seems like we're left with a plaque, with a park on the other side of a fence, and the Border Patrol watching over anything that might cross over it. This is one of the busiest extensions of my office. This wonderful counter here, where we meet with the people across this fence who are also preoccupied with the environmental health of the estuary. Sometimes when the lines at the border get too long, we facilitate our work by coming here. In the best of cases, it's where the two countries come together. It's not what divides them. And so we are initiating at a local level several projects that involve binational cooperation. It just seems like the only way to address water issues, air issues, waste disposal. It is not Mexico's problem or the U.S.'s problem. It's a common problem. Concretely, this project that we are working on, called the Tijuana River Watershed Management Project, is originally inspired by the protection of one part of the watershed. That led us to see that there wasn't a single thing happening on the watershed that didn't have to do with the estuary, and therefore it had to be brought to light. So what we have now is scientists on both sides of the border, academics on both sides of the border, local governments, state governments, water managers, city developers, and definitely the residents who are sensitive and affected by many of the decisions that are being made by governments.
At the border's midpoint are Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. Juarez has over 300 maquiladoras and 1.7 million residents. It has no sewage treatment plant. All of the city's wastes empty into this canal, which flows for 60 miles before it is diverted into farmlands or into the Rio Grande River. As serious as this is, the people of Juarez and its neighbor El Paso have a more urgent environmental problem. It's the quality of the air they breathe. Juarez and El Paso form a continuous metropolitan area separated only by a border that follows the Rio Grande River. You have to look hard to see where one country stops and the other starts. This is Juarez. This is El Paso. More than 2 million people live in a basin that is ringed by mountains, a geography that traps and concentrates air pollution. This is a story that begins on the U.S. side of the border.
El Paso has had a history of bad air quality. We've exceeded standards for the criteria pollutants for at least 20 years. But when the Environmental Protection Agency was demanding that El Paso come into compliance, we attempted to inform them that the problem was not all El Paso's, but rather emissions that were coming from south of the border. And for many years, the EPA refused to accept the fact that some of the pollution did not originate in El Paso.
El Paso has tried everything. It requires annual vehicle inspection. Cars must use expensive, cleaner-burning fuels. Little used streets are paved. The solvents in household products like paint and personal deodorants are controlled. Dry cleaners, printing presses, and auto paint shops have severe restrictions. New industry is limited. And all this at great sacrifice. El Paso is the 4th poorest city in the United States.
We're doing more and more in El Paso, but it's being canceled by the growth and activities in Ciudad Juarez.
Air pollution in Juarez comes from unregulated industrial emissions, burning garbage dumps, and vehicle exhaust. 85% of the cars in Juarez are more than 10 years old. And Juarez is a center for brick making. There are whole neighborhoods of brick kilns where tires and other dirty burning fuels have been used. About 70% of the streets in this growing city are unpaved, and dust hangs in the air. In the winter, many of the city's poor residents burn trash or cardboard to heat their homes. And on the way back to the U.S., long lines of cars, their motors idling, wait, sometimes up to 3 hours, to pass through U.S. Customs.
All the work that we've done in El Paso, all the controls that we've implemented, and yet we don't see the reductions. So we have all realized that in order to reduce pollution in the basin, in El Paso, we should put our dollars and our efforts into something in Mexico or in Ciudad Juarez that will have a benefit not only to El Paso but to the entire air basin. For example, if we help the citizens of Ciudad Juarez to tune up their cars at least once a year, that will decrease pollution from their vehicles by a good 80%. If we were to invest those few dollars in the U.S., the net reduction would probably be maybe 5 or 10%.
The cities began to work together in 1993. A key supporter in Juarez was Francisco Nunez, the city's director of sanitation. He has an inspiring history. When federal environmental officials failed to enforce the rules limiting industrial discharges into his city's sewers, he built his own labs, did his own tests, and he exposed wrongdoing.
Now we have around 96% of the total industry under control. That was not easy. The federal government, the Chamber of Industry, and the other association of maquiladoras, they go against us because we're trying to regulate them. That's incredible. And well, they are very angry. They was very angry, and they call me a ecological terrorist.
Now, a binational group from industry, academia, environmental organizations, and from all levels of government decide how to manage the binational air they breathe. It took a formal treaty signed in 1996 to give them control over what they call their common airshed.
I think the first thing you have to understand, the first complication is the fact that federal regulations and federal programs in the United States or in Mexico are designed to stop at the border. And so if the problem is a common airshed, there is no real existing federal regulation or federal program to help you solve the problem. In fact, you have to break through the existing regulations in order to deal with the problem. Now, fortunately, with respect to the U.S.-Mexico border, we do have a series of agreements and a history of planning and meeting and discussing and working on the common problems that exist at the border. What we don't have a history of is the creation of management institutions that would actually put us in a mode where we could implement a solution to the problem. And so the creation of an International Air Quality Management District for the El Paso Juarez area is groundbreaking work in the sense of giving us a management institution.
We saw some of the binational effort's earliest accomplishments in Juarez with Carlos Rincon of the Environmental Defense Fund.
We are at the Mexico 68, which is a neighborhood of about 90 kilns for brick makers. The total amount of brick kilns in Ciudad Juarez is about 350. What the program for pollution reduction aims is to have the brick makers to use alternative fuels like LP gas, natural gas, or even a not so clean option, but is the better option economically, sawdust. The fuels that the brick makers have been accustomed, at one point it used to be tires, not anymore, at least here in Ciudad Juarez. Other scrap materials like pallets, cardboard, or wood sticks from some construction sites. But at one point, is whatever it burns, that's what you will use.
These wooden crates that we see are illegal.
Are illegal, yes. They're illegal.
Then, as we were being shown the newest and cleanest burning fuel, natural gas, a cloud of thick black smoke appeared a couple of blocks away.
Imagine how it was when there was tire burning. Family is a very important means of bringing the message, because you as a brick maker that have been breathing that for years and years, and probably your father did and your grandfather did, and if I tell you that it's bad for your health, he says, well, no, look, I'm okay. But if you tell them that their kids are breathing that and they're shown that they're losing part of their brain, immediately they will listen to you.
In Juarez, the biggest contributor to air pollution is the exhaust from automobiles. Since 1993, the city has required that every car pass a test of its exhaust system.
And at the same time, you can see the printout, pass or no pass, with a sticker or without sticker. So we will see it. Okay, it shows that it doesn't pass, and as you can see, there's a printout coming over there.
Because 40% of cars fail the test, there is more help. A binational partnership has established pre-inspection diagnostic centers where car owners get an evaluation and advice from a technician. In the process, students are being trained to become mechanics. Finally, we were off to see Juarez's first modern landfill. Until 1994, this was the site of uncontrolled burning. Now, layers of garbage are compacted and covered with dirt, and a major source of air pollution has been eliminated.
Several years ago, when the border environmental plan was drawn up between Mexico and the U.S. in preparation for NAFTA, the border plan was put together on the border cities of Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. But I think it's time that government officials start realizing that the solutions to the border have to come from the border, because we're the ones that are living with it. We're the ones that are familiar with it, and we have the answers.
Along the border there is optimism and there is progress, but there have also been setbacks. The North American Free Trade Agreement established the NAD Bank. It makes loans to border cities so that they can build the infrastructure that should have come before industrialization: drinking water plants, wastewater treatment plants, and waste disposal facilities. The Border Environment Cooperation Commission, called the BEC, a binational group with government and significantly non-government members, decides which projects the NAD Bank will fund. Unfortunately, NAFTA does not provide money for cleaning up existing hazardous waste contamination. There was a setback. In late 1994, 11 months after NAFTA went into effect, Mexico experienced a financial crisis. The peso lost over half of its value against the U.S. dollar. Crippling inflation followed. The devalued peso has created a building boom by foreign companies that has put increased pressure on the environment. At the same time, pollution control projects in Mexico, including those that might have been financed by NAD Bank loans, have been scaled down or put on hold. One example, a planned wastewater treatment plant for Juarez, its very first.
We start building in 15 days before this economic collapse comes here in Mexico. And we stop all these new construction of these wastewater treatment plants. We're trying to invest around $60 million only for this purpose. And well, everything now is stopped, but in the environmental area impacts worse than the other areas. Why? Because, well, the people try to survive first, and later they're trying to do something for the environment.
More U.S.-owned companies now obey the law and return their hazardous waste to the U.S. for disposal. But an estimated 44 tons a day, or 30%, is still disposed of illegally in Mexico. Those who hold the greatest power to improve the border's environment are the people who run the factories there. Ed Brecky's company makes circuit breakers. He is chairman of the Western Maquiladora Trade Association. He offers some hope.
The great majority of my generation are environmental people. I mean, I take my daughter every year to Earth Day. My daughter is a card-carrying member of Greenpeace, okay? I'm a member of Sierra Club. And that's how most of the people of my generation grew up. And the incentive is that, hey, that's the way to live your life and that's the way to run your business. If you want to go to a dollars and cents incentive, it just makes sense to do the environmentally right thing, because you're going to pay dearly for it later if you don't. So there's financial reasons to do it, and there's just common sense, I think, moral reasons to do it.
What's the cost per barrel to return waste to the United States?
It's very expensive. It depends what's in that barrel, of course, but it can easily be, for a 55-gallon drum, anywhere from $500 to $900.
Doesn't that create a real incentive to dispose of wastes illegally?
It doesn't create a real incentive to dispose of waste illegally for me, and I don't think for most companies, because if you dispose of that, if you take that $500 saving and dump it here in a few years, you could look at a several $million cleanup. So the math doesn't work out well for me.
They've got to catch you, though.
But they've got to catch you, yep.
I think there is a different attitude on the part of the Mexican environmental regulatory agencies, primarily because there was an effort made in the early 90s to really bring in some bright young people out of universities and even out of industries who really do care about their country's environment and want to enforce environmental laws. But they need the resources to be able to do that, and they need the political will of the government to back them up when they do take a strong enforcement action.
Enforcement in Mexico of all laws, including environmental ones, has been compromised by something everyone mentions, but nobody likes to discuss: corruption, bribery. La mordida, Mexicans call it, the bite.
Enforcement is diluted because of steps that are taken between the industry and the government officials, and they look the other way. It's unfortunate, but that's a fact of life on the border. And this is something that we deal with and we have to contend with. Again, we have a new breed of officials in Mexico in general, but we definitely have a new breed of local officials in Ciudad Juarez that don't have this attitude, and they have shown and have demonstrated to all of us that they do take enforcement very seriously.
It's not easy to deal with this problem of corruption, because the problem of corruption comes from the whole life of in this country. It's not easy. I think so. It's something that this administration trying to fight, and it's was successful thing. The corruption now here, at least in the local authorities, is something like part of the past.
In Juarez, encouragement comes in the form of lapel pins and street corner signs with this logo.
20 years ago, there were problems, and those problems, some of those problems continue today. Mexico has written an environmental law. It's a very good, very strong, it's a very complicated law, very similar to the one in the United States. Well, they've taken all the steps in the right direction, and yes, enforcement has been a problem. First came the law, now comes the enforcement. They're hiring inspectors, they're training inspectors, and enforcement will grow and increase over the coming years and make those problem people, I hate to say it, but if that's the reason they're in Mexico, then what they're going to do is they're going to move to another country that doesn't have environmental laws.